Elliot Cross put his hand around the flight attendant's throat in front of 40 people, and not one of them moved. He held it for 5 seconds. 5 seconds of a 62-year-old billionaire communicating to a 27-year-old woman exactly what $30 billion had taught him about who consequences applied to. When he released her, she hit the floor of the private terminal, and the silence that followed was the loudest thing Officer Jake Mercer had ever heard. He was 25 years old and 11 months into his K-9 assignment, and Rex was already moving before Jake finished processing what his eyes had just sent him. Subscribe right now and drop your city in the comments. I need to know how far this story reaches. Jake Mercer had drawn the O'Hare private terminal assignment because he was the junior K-9 officer in the district, and junior K-9 officers drew the assignments that senior K-9 officers had learned were either very boring or very complicated, with nothing in between. He had been running Rex through a routine sweep of the private aviation concourse for 40 minutes when the German Shepherd's body changed. Rex was 4 years old, tan and black, built with the specific density of a working dog that had never once been allowed to be anything other than exactly what he was trained to be. His amber eyes ran a constant inventory of everything within 100 feet, and his ears moved independently, each one tracking its own category of input. And Jake had learned in 11 months of working with him that the dog's body language was a communication system more reliable than anything else available on a scene. Right now, Rex's body was saying something that Jake's training classified immediately, and his instincts classified faster. The dog had locked. Not the narcotics alert, not the explosive response sequence. The full-body freeze that Rex used when a human being was in acute distress in his immediate vicinity. The specific stillness that meant something real was happening and required them to go toward it rather than away. Jake followed the dog's orientation and covered the 40 feet to the private terminal entrance in 9 seconds. The man's hand came off her throat before Jake reached the glass doors. He did not see the beginning of it. He saw the end of it. And the end of it was Nina Hart going down onto the polished floor of the private terminal with her hands catching her weight, and her body bent forward, and the specific sound of someone trying to pull air through a passage that had been compressed, coming through the glass before Jake got his hand on the door. He was inside before he finished deciding to go inside. Rex was beside him, not pulling ahead, not hanging back, matched to Jake's pace with the precision of a dog that had learned to read its handler's speed as directional information. Elliot Cross had already straightened his tie. That was the thing Jake's mind registered first, and could not stop registering. The man had released the woman. She had hit the floor, and in the time it took for her to catch herself, he had straightened his tie with the specific, unhurried adjustment of someone completing a minor task before moving on to the next item on the schedule. Silver hair. Dark suit that cost more than Jake's annual salary. A face that had been photographed beside presidents and printed on the covers of business publications for 2 decades, and that was currently arranging itself into the expression of a man who had been interrupted by a small inconvenience and was deciding how much attention to give it. 40 people in the private terminal. Airport staff, passengers waiting for their charters. 3 of Cross's personal security team positioned at 12-foot intervals along the wall. Not one person had moved when she went down. Not one person had gone to her. They were standing in the specific posture of people who had calculated the cost of responding and found it too high. And the calculation had happened so fast and so automatically that most of them probably hadn't consciously made it at all. Jake had made a different calculation. He had made it at a speed that bypassed conscious processing entirely and arrived at his feet before his brain finished the math. He crouched beside Nina Hart. She was on one knee now, the other foot planted, trying to push herself upright with the focused determination of someone who had decided that staying on the floor in front of these people was not a thing she was going to do. Her hand was at her throat. Her eyes were clear and angry and frightened and clear again, cycling through those states at a speed that told Jake her mind was working correctly, even while her body was catching up. "Don't move yet," he said quietly. "Give yourself 10 seconds." She looked at him. Her eyes assessed him the way people assessed uniforms, not trusting the symbol, but checking the face behind it for something the symbol could not guarantee. She found whatever she was looking for because she stopped trying to stand and let him check her pulse with 2 fingers against her wrist. Fast, but even. Her airway was open. The compression had been brief enough not to cause structural damage, but the bruising would show in 40 minutes and was already visible at the surface of her skin. Rex had positioned himself at Jake's left, facing outward, his body angled toward the 3 security personnel who had moved 3 steps closer since Jake entered the terminal. The dog was not aggressive. He was present in the way that shut down approaches, without requiring any display of what he could do if an approach happened anyway. The security personnel stopped moving. "Officer." The voice came from Jake's right, and it had the specific quality of a voice that had been used for decades to make rooms comply. Not loud, not raised. The authority was not in the volume. It was in the certainty that the volume was unnecessary. "This is a private facility, and you are interfering with a private matter." Jake looked up without standing. He was still crouched beside Nina, and he did not stand, because standing would have communicated something about whose terms the next part of this conversation was going to happen on. And he had not decided that yet. The man standing 6 feet away was Elliot Cross. Jake had seen his face 1,000 times on screens and print, and he had never felt anything particular about it, because faces on screens and print were not faces in rooms. The face in the room was different. Up close, 62 years old, the features that photographed as distinguished read as something harder and more specific. The eyes were the most important part. They were the eyes of a man who had not been told no in a context that mattered for a very long time, and who had therefore stopped including the possibility in his operational model. "Sir," Jake said, keeping his voice at the specific register he had been trained to use when the goal was de-escalation and the sub-goal was buying time to assess. "I need you to stay where you are." Cross looked at him the way men looked at obstacles. Not with anger, with a specific evaluation of someone calculating how much time it would take to move something out of his path, and whether that time was worth the expenditure. "Young man," Cross said, "do you know who I am?" "Yes," Jake said. He stood up then, because he had decided. "I need you to stay where you are." A man in a dark suit appeared at Cross's left elbow. Late 40s, narrow build, the carefully groomed face of someone who was paid to manage the space between powerful people and their consequences. He produced a business card between 2 fingers with the practiced ease of someone who had opened 1,000 conversations this way. "Andrew Fell, counsel for Mr. Cross. Whatever you think you observed here falls under private security protocol and is not within your jurisdiction as a public officer on a restricted premises." Jake did not take the card. "She's on a public concourse." Fell's smile remained precisely calibrated. "This is a private aviation terminal operating under separate legal framework. Your K-9 unit's presence here is contingent on—" "She has visible injury," Jake said. He kept his voice even. "That's my jurisdiction, regardless of the framework." He pulled his radio with his left hand. "And I'm calling it in." He made the call without waiting for Fell to finish the sentence he had started. He gave the location, the nature of the incident, the subject involved, and requested a supervisor and a medical unit, using the specific procedural language that created a record at the moment of transmission that could not be undone by anything that happened after it. Rex shifted slightly beside him. The dog's ears had moved in the direction of the east corridor. The specific ear pivot that meant something in that direction had registered as significant, without yet rising to the level of alert. Jake filed it. He kept his eyes on Cross. Fell was speaking again. His voice had dropped by a register, the shift from public presentation to private communication. "Officer, I want to help you understand the full picture before this goes any further. Mr. Cross has significant relationships with the district's senior command. This situation, as you're characterizing it, has a different characterization that your commander will be hearing about within the next 15 minutes. Jake looked at Fell. He was 25 years old, and he had been a police officer for 23 months, and a canine handler for 11 of them. And he had not yet accumulated the particular fatigue that came from years of watching powerful people use the machinery of relationships and phone calls and characterizations to redirect outcomes that should have been simple. He had therefore also not yet developed the protective cynicism that sometimes accompanied that fatigue and could, in its worst expression, cause a person to decide that simple outcomes were not worth fighting for. He was still new enough to find the simple outcome worth everything. "I'm going to need a full statement from Miss Hart," Jake said. He turned to Nina. She had gotten to her feet while Fell was talking, the 10 seconds he had asked for having stretched into 30, and she was standing with her shoulders squared and her hand no longer at her throat, and her eyes doing the same cycling they had been doing since he found her on the floor, except that the frightened portion of the cycle was getting shorter each time, and the angry portion was getting longer. "I want to give one," she said. Her voice was rough at the edges from the compression, but it was steady, and it was loud enough for the 40 people standing in the terminal to hear it clearly. Something moved through the room. Not dramatic. The specific small shift of people who have been watching a situation and have just received new information about which direction it is moving. Cross looked at Nina with the expression of a man recalibrating. He had put his hand on her throat because he believed it would produce silence, and the silence would produce the outcome he needed, and the whole thing would be managed before it became an event. She was not being silent. The expression on his face was not anger. It was the look of someone encountering a variable their model had not accounted for and deciding how to adjust. He looked at Jake. "You have no idea," he said quietly, "what you are putting yourself in the middle of." Jake held his gaze. "I know what I saw," he said. "That's where I'm starting." Rex turned his head at that moment and looked directly at the east corridor, with both ears fully forward, the complete attention configuration that was one step below the formal alert. Jake caught it in his peripheral vision, and his body registered it before his mind completed the interpretation. Something in the corridor, something the dog had decided was significant enough to dedicate his full attention to. Jake did not look away from Cross, but he noted it. Nina had her phone out. Her hands were not shaking. She was photographing the bruising at her throat with the methodical focus of someone who had decided that evidence was the most important thing available to her right now, and was collecting it before it could be taken from her, or fade, or be characterized as something other than what it was. Fell saw her doing it. His expression went through something controlled and fast. He took one step toward her. Rex moved between them without instruction, not aggressively, simply occupying the space that the step had been aimed at with the quiet authority of a dog that understood its job as including the protection of people who needed it, and had never required anyone to explain that in specific terms. Fell stopped. Cross watched the dog hold the space, and something moved across his face that was more specific than calculation. For the first time since Jake had entered the terminal, the certainty in the older man's expression had company. Not doubt exactly. The earliest possible precursor to doubt. The moment before a person who has not questioned their own invulnerability begins to. Jake's radio came back with confirmation that a supervisor was en route and a medical unit was 2 minutes out. He acknowledged it without looking away from the scene in front of him, and felt, for the first time since he came through the glass doors, the specific sensation of a situation that had been entirely in one person's control, beginning to distribute that control among the people who should have had some of it from the start. Rex looked at the east corridor one more time. Then he looked at Jake, with the amber eyes that communicated things no training manual had fully captured. The look that said, "I found something, and I am waiting for you to be ready to hear it." Jake was not ready yet, but he was going to be. The terminal was not quiet anymore, and it was not compliant. And the 40 people standing in it were not all looking in the same direction they had been looking 5 minutes ago. And Elliot Cross, who had straightened his tie while a woman lay on the floor he had put her on, was standing in the middle of it, looking for the first time in decades, like a man who might need to recalculate. The medical unit arrived in 90 seconds, which was faster than Jake expected, and told him someone had already been close, or someone had anticipated this. 2 paramedics, a man and a woman, moving with the efficiency of people who treated urgency as a baseline rather than an exception. They went directly to Nina, without asking Jake where she was, because the bruising at her throat was visible from the door. Fell moved to intercept them. "She's been seen by private medical staff and—" "She hasn't," Nina said. Her voice carried across the terminal without effort and without performance. "I haven't been seen by anyone." The paramedics went around Fell the way water went around an obstacle, without drama, without engagement, simply finding the path that led to the person they were there to help. The female paramedic, mid-30s, dark hair, the specific competence of someone who had been in complicated situations before and had long since stopped being surprised by the human behaviors that produced them, crouched beside Nina and began the assessment with practiced hands. Jake watched Fell recalculate. The lawyer had been operating on the assumption that the first 60 seconds were the critical window, and that if he could manage those 60 seconds, the rest would follow his management. The 60 seconds were over, and they had not gone the way he planned, and now he was in a different kind of situation, one that required a different approach, and Jake could see him locating that approach in real time. The approach arrived in the form of a phone call. Fell stepped back, produced his phone, and made a call that lasted 40 seconds. Jake watched the call without watching it. Peripheral awareness, the way he was trained to track multiple points of a scene simultaneously. He was watching Cross more directly. The billionaire had not moved from his position near the center of the terminal. He was standing with the specific stillness of a man who had decided that movement communicated more than stillness, and who therefore used stillness as a management tool. Rex touched Jake's knee with his nose. One brief contact. Jake looked down. The dog was oriented toward the east corridor again, but the orientation had changed quality. This was no longer the pre-alert curiosity of something registered at the edges. This was the specific, focused attention that preceded the formal alert sequence. Something in that corridor had gotten closer. Or something in that corridor had done something that amplified its signature. Jake's supervisor arrived at 12:54. Sergeant Diana Cole, 44, with the kind of face that had stopped performing patience years ago, and now simply had it. She came through the terminal door, reading the room the way experienced supervisors read rooms, not starting with the loudest person or the most dramatic element, but with the layout of where everyone was standing relative to everyone else. Because position communicated relationship, and relationship communicated what had actually happened before you had the words for it. She found Jake's position first, then Nina with the paramedics, then Cross standing in the center, then Fell, phone down now, moving toward her with the specific momentum of a man who had been waiting for someone with more formal authority to arrive so he could begin the conversation he had been preparing. Cole let him begin it. She listened for 45 seconds, with the expression of someone letting a thing fully present itself before she responded to it. Fell explained jurisdiction, private terminal framework, Mr. Cross's standing, the characterization of events, the senior command relationships, The phone call he had made 14 minutes ago that would be producing results shortly. He delivered it smoothly, professionally, without apparent pressure, the verbal equivalent of a structure designed to seem permanent. Cole said, "Is she injured?" Fell paused. "There may be some." "Is she injured?" Cole said again. Same tone, same pace. The repetition was not impatience. It was precision. "There is visible bruising that may be consistent with." "Then I have jurisdiction," Cole said. She turned to Jake. "What do you have?" Jake gave it to her in sequence. The timeline from Rex locking to Nina on the floor, to Cross straightening his tie, to the present moment. He gave it factually and completely, and he included the 6 words Fell had said about senior command relationships, because those 6 words were part of the record, the same as everything else. Cole listened without interrupting. When he finished, she nodded once. "Get her statement," she said. "Full incident documentation. Nobody leaves this terminal until it's complete." Fell stepped forward. "Sergeant, I want to be clear that detaining Mr. Cross without—" "I'm not detaining anyone," Cole said. "I'm completing documentation of an incident involving a visibly injured party. Everyone present is a potential witness. Witnesses don't leave active scenes." She met Fell's eyes with the direct, flat honesty of a woman who had run out of diplomacy for this specific type of conversation approximately 15 years ago. "That's not a legal position. It's standard procedure. If your client would like to challenge standard procedure, he can do that later, in writing, to someone who has time for it." Fell's jaw moved. Cross spoke from 12 feet away. "Sergeant Cole." His voice had the quality of a man retrieving a specific tool from a specific drawer. Precise, chosen, deployed. "I believe you know Commissioner Bradley. We were at the same fundraiser 2 weeks ago. I'm sure he'd appreciate a call before this goes any further." The terminal was very quiet. Cole looked at Cross for a moment. Jake watched her face. It did not change. It had the specific quality of a face that had received this type of communication before and had developed a permanent response to it that was neither angry nor compliant, but was absolutely clear. "If Commissioner Bradley has something to say to me about this incident, he can say it after the documentation is complete," she said. "Anything he says before that will be included in the incident report as a notation of external contact." She paused. "That's also standard procedure." Something moved across Cross's face. Not the precursor to doubt that Jake had seen before. The thing after the precursor. The moment a person who has not questioned their own invulnerability begins to genuinely question it for the first time. Nina's voice came from where the paramedics were working. "I want to give my statement now," she said, "while everything is clear." Jake crossed to her. He pulled his notebook because documentation done on paper in the officer's own hand carried a specific weight in proceedings that differed from digital entry, and he wanted every layer of formality available to this record. He sat on the edge of a seating unit beside Nina, at her eye level, his posture communicating that this conversation was hers to lead and he was there to record it accurately rather than to guide it toward a particular shape. "Take your time," he said. "From the beginning." Nina looked at him. She had the eyes of someone who had been deciding how much to trust the situation and had arrived at a decision. She had reached it quickly, which told Jake either that she trusted easily, which was possible, or that she had information that made the trust calculation straightforward, which was also possible and more interesting. "I've been on this route for 8 months," she said. "Cross's private charter, Chicago to New York, twice a week. Standard flight crew assignment. I'm the senior attendant on this route." She paused. 3 weeks ago, I noticed a discrepancy in the cargo manifest, a sealed container in the aft hold that was listed under a shell company name that didn't match the usual freight documentation Cross's team provides. She looked at Jake steadily. I flagged it internally. 2 days later, I was reassigned off the route. Last week, I was called back on, with no explanation. Jake was writing. His pen did not slow down. What happened today? Before landing, I went back to check the aft hold. Standard pre-arrival inventory. She held his gaze. The container was there again. Different shell company name. Same seal type. She swallowed, and the swallowing was careful, in the way of someone managing soreness. When we landed, I told him I was going to report it. That's when She stopped, not because she couldn't say it, because she was deciding how to say it, in the way that would be most useful in a record, rather than most satisfying in a room. He put his hand on my throat, she said. And he said, and I'm giving you exact words, you don't know what you saw, and you won't say what you didn't see. Then he let go. A pause. Then he straightened his tie. Jake wrote every word. The container, Jake said. Did you photograph it? Nina reached into the pocket of her uniform jacket and produced her phone. She opened the camera roll and turned it toward him. 4 photographs, taken from multiple angles, clear and deliberately framed. The kind of photographs taken by someone who had been thinking about evidence before the situation gave them reason to. I took those before I said anything to him, she said. I knew what the conversation was going to cost me. I wanted to make sure it cost something on the other side, too. Jake looked at the photographs, the container, the seal, the shell company label, which he photographed with his own phone from her screen. He looked at it for a moment and filed it in the specific mental folder that contained things that were more significant than they appeared on initial contact. Rex turned fully toward the east corridor and made a sound. Not a bark. The low, controlled vocalization that was one step below the formal alert. The sound that said, I have identified something and I am asking for authorization to pursue it. Jake stood immediately. He looked at Cole across the terminal. My dog has a hit on the east corridor, he said. Every head in the terminal turned. Fell moved 3 steps toward Cross. Cross did not move. His eyes went to the east corridor, and Jake watched them go there, and watched something in his posture change. Subtle. The kind of change that only registered if you had been watching a person closely enough to know their baseline. Cross knew what was in the east corridor. Cole said, Go. Jake nodded to Nina. Stay with the sergeant. He looked at Rex. Show me. Rex moved. Not fast, deliberately. The specific pace of a working dog following a confirmed scent, with the focused patience of a dog that had been waiting to be given this instruction for the past 20 minutes. Jake stayed at the dog's shoulder, hand near but not on his radio, reading Rex's body for the information it was providing in real time. The scent was strengthening. Rex's nose was lower, and his ears were fully forward, and his tail was straight. The complete configuration of a dog that was close to what it had been tracking. The east corridor was the service passage that connected the private terminal to the charter aircraft loading bay, the pathway that ground crew used to transfer cargo between the aircraft and the terminal's private storage facility, without passing through the main concourse. It was a corridor that existed specifically to move things between the plane and the building quickly and with minimal visibility. Rex stopped at a door 12 feet into the corridor. He sat. He looked at Jake with the amber eyes. Alert. Clear. Certain. The formal alert. Jake's hand went to his radio. He looked at the door. It was a standard maintenance access door, numbered, with a key card reader. The card reader showed a green light. The door was unlocked. He keyed his radio. Sergeant Cole, my dog has a formal alert on Maintenance Access East 4. I need you here, and I need a supervisor from Airport Authority. Cole's voice came back immediately. Copy. En route. Jake looked at the door. He looked at Rex. Rex was watching the door with the amber eyes that had found every significant thing today and had not once been wrong. Jake thought about what Nina had said. Cargo container. Shell company. Seal. 3 weeks ago, flagged, reassigned, called back. The man who had put his hand on her throat to make her unsay what she had already said. $30 billion. 2 decades of photographs with presidents. Senior command relationships. Phone calls made in 40-second windows that were supposed to change outcomes before outcomes became events. And a dog sitting in a corridor next to a door with a green light on the card reader, waiting with the patient certainty of an animal that did not know how to be wrong about what mattered and did not need anyone's authorization to decide that it mattered in the first place. Cole arrived with Airport Authority Security Manager Thomas Harding, 56, a man with the specific gravity of someone who had run a large facility for a long time and understood that the gravity of a facility was only as real as the procedures that upheld it. He looked at Rex. He looked at the door. He looked at Jake. "What does your dog have?" Harding said. "Controlled substance signature," Jake said. "Formal alert. The dog doesn't present false alerts." Harding looked at the door for a long moment. Jake watched him make the calculation. The same calculation that every person in authority made in situations where the path was correct and the cost of the path was high. He watched Harding locate the person he was when things were easy and compare that person to the person the current situation required and find, with visible effort but genuine result, that the two were close enough to hold. "Open it," Harding said. The door opened, and what was inside it was not complicated and was not ambiguous and was not something that $30 billion or senior command relationships or 40-second phone calls was going to be able to characterize its way out of. Because what was inside it was exactly what Rex had said it was. And Rex had never once said something was there that wasn't. Jake stood in the doorway and looked at it, and thought about Elliot Cross straightening his tie, and felt something that was not triumph, and was not satisfaction, but was the specific feeling of a situation that had been oriented away from the truth, being, by slow and documented degrees, oriented back toward it. He keyed his radio. "Sergeant Cole," he said. "You need to see this." Cole saw it and went still for exactly 2 seconds. Jake had seen his sergeant process difficult information before. She was not a woman who performed reactions. When something mattered, she became quieter and more precise, which was the opposite of how most people responded to significant things, and was the quality that made her the best supervisor Jake had worked under in 23 months of service. She stood in the doorway of Maintenance Access East 4 and looked at what was inside, and became quieter and more precise. Then she said, "Nobody touches anything." The storage room connected to the charter aircraft loading bay through a secondary access that bypassed the standard cargo logging station. That bypass was the structural fact that made what was inside the room possible. Without the bypass, the contents would have passed through documentation. With the bypass, they moved between the aircraft and the private terminal storage in the specific shadow that exists between official systems, when those systems are designed to accommodate the preferences of people who pay for accommodation. What Rex had found was not ambiguous. Sealed packaging, marked with the same shell company identifier that appeared in Nina's photographs, stacked with the specific organization of something that had been moved this way before and had a system for being moved this way. The quantity was not personal. The quantity was the quantity of someone who had decided that the risk of scale was worth the return of scale, and who had decided that for long enough that the decision had become operational infrastructure. Harding stood beside Cole. He was looking at the room with the expression of someone who had been running a major airport facility for 16 years and was in the process of understanding that something had been happening inside that facility that his systems had not caught, which meant either his systems had failed or his systems had been helped to fail. And both possibilities were currently sitting in his chest with equal weight. "How long?" he said, not to Jake, not to Cole, to himself, in the specific tone of a man asking himself a question he was not sure he wanted answered. Cole looked at him. "That's part of what gets answered," she said. She turned to Jake. "Call it in. Full narcotics response. DEA notification. Federal Aviation Authority. Use the full protocol sequence." Jake made the calls in order. He was 25 years old and 11 months into his canine assignment, and he was making calls that would move through federal channels and land on desks in buildings he had never been inside. And he made them with the same voice he used for everything, even and documented and complete, because the voice was the record, and the record was the only thing that survived intact when powerful people decided to contest what had happened. Rex sat beside him while he called, amber eyes on the room, tail still, the patient presence of a dog whose job was complete and who was therefore simply being present while the humans finished catching up to what he had found 20 minutes ago. Fell appeared at the corridor entrance. He had gotten past the officer Cole had stationed at the terminal door, which meant he had either found a reason the officer accepted or found a gap the officer hadn't covered, and both possibilities were professionally interesting to Jake. Fell looked at the room with the specific look of a lawyer who has arrived at a scene and is calculating simultaneously what it means for his client and what it means for the strategy he had been running for the past 40 minutes. The strategy he had been running was now a different strategy. Jake could see the reconfiguration happening in real time behind Fell's eyes. "I need to speak with Mr. Cross immediately," Fell said. "Mr. Cross is in the terminal with Sergeant Cole," Jake said. "I'm his counsel. I have the right to." "You have the right to speak with him," Jake said. "The room you're standing outside is an active evidence scene, and you can't enter it. The terminal where your client is standing is 40 feet that direction." He paused. "I'd suggest moving quickly. The federal notifications are already in." Fell looked at him. He was calculating something about Jake, and Jake let him calculate it, because whatever conclusion Fell arrived at about a 25-year-old canine officer in a blue uniform was Fell's conclusion to reach. And Jake's job was the documentation, not the impression management. Fell turned and moved back toward the terminal. Harding looked at Jake. "The bypass access on this room," he said. "It requires a level 3 clearance card. There are 9 people on this airport with level 3 clearance for this corridor." Jake looked at him. "I need that list." Harding pulled out his phone without being asked twice. He was a man who had just understood that something had been wrong inside his facility, and who had made a clean, immediate decision about which side of that wrongness he was going to stand on. He sent the list to Jake's department email in 40 seconds. Jake forwarded it to Cole without looking at the names, because the names belonged to the investigation and not to him, and the discipline of staying inside his lane was what kept the record clean. Cole's voice came through the radio. "Jake, you need to come back to the terminal." Something in her tone, not alarm, the specific quality she used when a situation had developed a new dimension that required his physical presence rather than a radio description. He left Harding at the door with instructions to hold the position and walked Rex back to the terminal. Cross had moved, not out of the terminal. He was still present, but he had shifted from the center of the room to a position near the east wall, which was closer to the corridor Jake had just come from, and he was speaking in a very low voice to one of his security personnel, the kind of low-voice conversation that was designed to look like nothing while being something. Cole was standing with Nina and the paramedics near the seating area. She looked at Jake when he entered and tilted her head almost imperceptibly in Cross's direction. Jake crossed the terminal. He did not approach aggressively. He approached the way he had been trained to approach situations, where the threat level was uncertain and the person's status was complex, with the specific neutrality that created space for the encounter to go in multiple directions, none of which were predetermined. "Mr. Cross," Jake said, "I need you to move back to the center of the terminal." Cross looked at him with the eyes that had been calculating since Jake walked through the glass doors 45 minutes ago. "I'm having a private conversation." "There are no private conversations on an active evidence scene," Jake said. "Please move to the center of the terminal." The security personnel Cross had been speaking with looked at Jake. He was broad, mid-30s, the specific build of someone who had been hired for his physical presence as much as his professional skills. And he had been watching Jake for 45 minutes, with the expression of someone who had not yet decided how seriously to take the 25-year-old in the blue uniform. Rex looked at him, just looked at him, amber eyes steady, not threatening, simply occupying the full attention of a dog that had decided this person required monitoring. The security personnel looked at the dog for a moment, and then looked at Cross, and made the calculation that most people made when Rex looked at them that way. He took a step back. Cross moved toward the center of the terminal. Jake watched him move and noted the path he took, slightly angled, not direct. The path of a man who was orienting himself relative to the east corridor, without wanting that orientation to be visible. And Jake filed it the same way he filed everything, in the mental record that matched the physical one he was building with every radio call and photograph and statement. The twist arrived at 13:47. Cole called him to the side of the room, away from Cross and Fell and the witnesses. Her voice was low, and her face had done the thing it did when she was managing information that had a blast radius. "The DEA contact I reached," she said, "told me something before I could give her the full situation." Jake waited. "There's an active federal investigation," Cole said. "Has been for 7 months. Cross's charter operation, the shell company cargo routing, the private terminal bypass usage at 4 airports. The DEA has been building the case since last spring." She looked at Jake directly. "They have an informant inside Cross's organization." The room did not go quiet. The room was already fairly quiet. But something in Jake's processing went very still. "Nina Hart," he said. Cole looked at him. "How did you—" "She flagged the cargo 3 weeks ago and got reassigned," Jake said. "Then she got called back on the route with no explanation. Someone wanted her back on that plane, and the only person who benefits from her being on that plane today, instead of any other day, is whoever needs a witness at the scene when the evidence is there to be found." He paused. She took photographs before she confronted him. She was already thinking about documentation. She was already thinking about the record. Cole held his gaze. "The DEA contact told me their informant was scheduled to make contact with us today. They didn't tell me how the contact was going to be initiated." She paused. "She was going to give herself a reason for us to be called." Jake thought about Nina on the floor, hand at her throat, eyes cycling through fear and anger and clarity. The specific steadiness of someone who had been carrying something for 7 months and had chosen today to set it down in the most visible way available. She had known what was going to happen when she told Cross she was going to report the container. She had known what he would do. She had taken the photographs first, and then she had told him, and she had gone down on the floor of the private terminal in front of 40 witnesses and a canine unit running a routine sweep, and she had stayed on the floor for the 10 seconds Jake had asked her for. And then she had gotten up, and she had been the clearest and steadiest witness in the room. She had not been a victim who became a witness. She had been both from the beginning, simultaneously, on purpose. Jake looked across the terminal to where Nina was sitting with the paramedics, phone in hand, eyes moving through the room with the alert patience of someone monitoring a situation she had set in motion and was watching resolve. She did not look at Jake. She was looking at Cross. Cross was standing in the center of the terminal with Fell beside him, and the conversation between them had changed quality in the past 3 minutes. The specific quality change of a lawyer who has received new information and is communicating its implications to a client who is receiving those implications with the expression of a man discovering that the structure he has been standing inside has been hollow for longer than he knew. The federal response arrived at 14:02. Not the full tactical presentation that news reports dramatized. 2 federal agents in plain clothes, with identification and the specific economy of movement of people, who had been building toward this moment for 7 months, and were now executing the final step of a sequence they had rehearsed in detail. They came through the terminal door and went directly to Cole and spoke to her for 90 seconds, and then turned toward Cross. The lead agent was a woman named Vasquez, mid-40s, with the flat professional affect of someone who felt nothing particular about this moment except the specific satisfaction of a procedure completing correctly. She approached Cross, with Fell already moving to intercept. "Andrew Fell, counsel for Mr. Cross," Fell said, "by instinct and by training. Whatever you believe you have here." "We have 7 months," Vasquez said. She looked at Cross over Fell's shoulder. "Mr. Cross, I'm placing you under arrest on federal charges, including narcotics trafficking, conspiracy, and obstruction of a federal investigation." She paused. "You have the right to remain silent." Cross looked at her. He looked at Fell. He looked at the room around him, the 40 people who had stood still when Nina went down and who were now standing still in a completely different way. The stillness of witnesses rather than the stillness of complicity. Then he looked at Jake. Jake was standing near the east corridor entrance with Rex at his left heel, and the blue uniform, and the short dark hair, and the 25-year-old face that Cross had looked at earlier as an obstacle to be moved, and had apparently revised his assessment of at some point during the past hour, because the way he looked at Jake now was different. Not with respect, which would have been too clean, with the specific look of a man recalculating a variable he had underweighted and arriving at a number he did not like. Rex looked back at Cross with the amber eyes, patient, certain, already done with this part and ready for whatever came next. Fell was talking. He was going to be talking for a long time, in rooms and on phones and in documents. The long professional aftermath of a situation that had moved outside the scope of what he had been hired to manage. Cross was listening, and not listening. The specific quality of someone whose primary attention has turned inward to the recalculation that was going to occupy him for a very long time. Nina Hart set her phone down in her lap and looked at Jake across the terminal, with the specific expression of a person who has been carrying something alone for a very long time and has just placed it in the hands of the people who were built to hold it. Jake nodded at her once. The acknowledgement of someone who understood, now, the full weight of what she had been carrying, and what today had cost her to set down. She nodded back. Rex looked up at Jake with the amber eyes, and then looked around the terminal with the easy patience of a dog who had done his job completely and was now simply present, watching the humans finish the work that his nose and his loyalty had made possible. Unhurried, certain, exactly where he was supposed to be. Cross was processed without spectacle, which was the correct outcome and also the most unsettling one for the 40 people who had been standing in the terminal since noon. Spectacle would have given them something to react to. The absence of it left them with only the quiet inevitability of a man being walked out of a room he had controlled for 2 hours. And that quiet was heavier than any noise would have been. Vasquez handled the transfer with the specific economy of a federal agent completing a procedure she had executed enough times that the procedure no longer required her full attention. which freed that attention for the variables that still needed managing. She was already on her phone before Cross reached the door, coordinating with a team that had been positioned at 3 other points in the airport since 1300. The specific coordination of an operation that had been built over 7 months and was now running its final sequence. Fell walked out beside his client with the professional composure of a man who had just had the floor removed from a building he thought was structurally sound, and was making the very fast calculation about what the building's collapse would cost him versus what it would cost him to walk away from the building before the rest came down. Cole watched them go, and then turned to Jake with the expression she used when the operational phase was over and the documentation phase was beginning, which, in her professional opinion, was the more important phase, because documentation was the phase that determined whether the operational phase had actually accomplished anything permanent. "I need your full incident report on my desk before end of shift," she said. "It'll be there before that," Jake said. She looked at him for a moment. "You did good today," she said. It was not effusive. It was the specific statement of a supervisor who said things because they were accurate and not because they served any other purpose. Jake nodded. He would have said something about Rex, but Cole was already moving toward the DEA agents to coordinate the next layer of documentation, the layer that connected the terminal storage room to the aircraft, to the shell company identifiers, to the 7-month federal case that would now proceed to prosecution, with the specific advantage of having been witnessed on a private terminal floor by 40 people, including a uniformed officer whose body camera had been running since he walked through the glass doors. He had not mentioned the body camera to Fell. Fell had not asked. In Jake's experience, lawyers who were very confident in their client's position often neglected to ask about body cameras because their confidence operated on the assumption that the officer would either not be running one or would not have been close enough for the footage to matter. Jake had been running his since the 3rd week of his assignment because Cole had told him once that the officers who ran their cameras on routine sweeps were the officers whose footage was usable when routine sweeps became something else. And Cole's advice had never been wrong in a way that cost him. He found a quiet section of the terminal seating and sat with Rex and began the incident report on his phone, typing with the specific focus of someone who understood that the story he was telling in official language right now was the story that would matter in courtrooms and proceedings for as long as this case ran. And it would run for a long time. He wrote it in sequence. He wrote it factually. He did not write anything about what he had felt when he came through the glass doors and saw the man straightening his tie. He did not write anything about the specific quality of the calculation he had made when the 6-word threat came through and he had decided to keep documenting. Those things were true, and they were part of what had happened, but they were not the record. The record was what happened in sequence and in fact, and the record was what lasted. Rex lay down beside him with his chin on his paws and watched the terminal with the amber eyes that had been watching it for 2 hours and were still watching it with the same quality of attention, not because the threat level required it, but because the dog did not have an off switch for attention to things that mattered. It was simply how he was built. The twist that arrived at 14:31 came from Harding. The airport security manager had been coordinating with the DEA agents in the East Corridor for 40 minutes when he came back to the terminal with the specific expression of a man who has found something he was not looking for and is deciding whether it changes the shape of everything or only the shape of some things. He found Jake in the seating area and sat across from him without preamble. "The Level 3 clearance list," Harding said. "The 9 people with access to the bypass corridor." "Yes," Jake said. "One of those 9 has been on medical leave for 6 weeks," Harding said. "She hasn't badged into this airport in 43 days. Jake looked at him. But her credential has been used 11 times in the past 6 weeks, Harding said. Always in the 30-minute window before a cross-charter arrival. Always for access to the East 4 storage room. He paused. I pulled the badge reader logs going back 8 months. The pattern starts exactly 1 month after she went on leave. Someone had been using a current employee's active credential to access the bypass. The same method, the same vulnerability structure as the ghost credential operation at the Dallas tarmac that federal agents had documented in a separate case the previous week. Jake had not known about the Dallas case when he walked through the terminal door at noon. But he was being told about it now by Vasquez's partner, a man named Chen, who had arrived from the East Corridor while Harding was explaining the credential pattern, and who listened to the explanation with the expression of someone hearing a confirmation rather than a surprise. The credential exploitation follows the same technical signature as 3 other airports in the past 14 months, Chen said. We've been looking for the source. The person doing the exploitation has system-level access at multiple airports and has been rotating through employee credentials with a pattern that avoids the automated flags. He looked at Jake. Someone inside airport security infrastructure has been facilitating this network-wide. Harding went completely still. Not inside my team, he said. Not your team, Chen confirmed. The access exploitation at each airport originates from a contractor account. Different contractor at each location. Same parent company. He pulled out a tablet and showed Harding a company name. This contractor manages credentialing systems for 11 major airports across the country. They've had the contract for 4 years. Harding looked at the name. I know this company, he said. They did our system upgrade 3 years ago. They did everyone's system upgrade, Chen said. That's how they had the access. They built the vulnerability into the upgrade during installation. It was invisible to standard security audits because it looked like standard maintenance architecture. He paused. We found it 6 weeks ago in a different investigation. We've been waiting to move on it until we had the full network mapped. Jake understood then why Nina had been called back to the route last week. It was not Cross who had called her back. Cross had not known she was working with the DEA. He had reassigned her 3 weeks ago because she flagged the cargo, and he needed her off the route until the heat from the flag dissipated. But the DEA had needed her back on the route for today's operation, and the DEA had arranged the reassignment through a channel that Cross's team read as coming from the airline's standard crew scheduling, which it had because the DEA contact at the airline had processed the reassignment through official channels that left no fingerprints. Nina had come back knowing what today was going to require. She had taken the photographs before she spoke to Cross, and she had spoken to Cross knowing what he would do. And she had gone down on the floor, knowing that the K-9 unit running the perimeter sweep would respond, because the DEA's coordination with the Chicago district had included a notation that the East Terminal perimeter sweep ran from 1200 to 1300 on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and that the K-9 officer assigned to that sweep had a working dog with a documented narcotics detection record. Rex had been part of the plan. He just hadn't known it. Jake looked at Rex. Rex looked back with the amber eyes that held everything and gave nothing away. They used my dog, Jake said. Not with resentment, with the specific recognition of someone understanding the full shape of a situation they had been inside without knowing its full shape. Chen looked at him. Your dog found exactly what he was supposed to find, he said. The operation needed a clean, independent discovery, not a DEA search warrant that Cross's lawyers could characterize as prosecutorial overreach. A K-9 unit running a routine perimeter sweep, flagging an alert on a storage room, documented from the moment of discovery. He paused. Your body camera footage and your incident report are the foundation of the chain of custody that makes everything inside that room prosecutorially usable. Jake sat with that. He thought about the way the morning had felt routine for the first 40 minutes. The way Rex had changed the morning. The way Rex always changed things. By paying attention to what was true and communicating it without any interest in whether the communication was convenient. He thought about the 40 people in the terminal who had stood still, and the one person on the floor who had not been still at all, but had been the most active person in the room from the moment she chose to tell Cross what she was going to do, knowing what he would do in response, and arranging herself to be the most effective witness possible to her own assault. He thought about Commissioner Bradley's name being said in the middle of a terminal, and Cole not flinching. He thought about Harding, 16 years running a facility, looking at a room and choosing clean without being asked to. He thought about being 25 years old and holding a room because a dog had told him to stay. Cole came back to him at 14:58 with the expression she wore when the documentation was complete enough to proceed to the next phase, and the next phase required a conversation she wanted to have before it happened officially. "The phone call Cross made," she said. "Commissioner Bradley." Jake looked at her. "Bradley called the district at 14:15, she said. "He was told the incident was an active federal case and that any contact from outside the department regarding the case would be logged as a notation in the incident report." She paused. "He called back at 14:22 and said he had no further comment." Jake exhaled once. "Good," he said. Cole looked at him. "You understand that this doesn't end with today. Cross has resources, and Cross has lawyers, and the case is going to be long. And there are going to be people in positions of authority who make decisions that seem wrong for reasons that are not visible from where you're standing." She met his eyes directly. "You document everything. You tell the truth in every proceeding. You don't editorialize, and you don't embellish, and you don't get pulled into the narrative of your own role in this. The case is the case. You're a witness and an officer, and that's what you remain." "Yes," Jake said. She looked at him for a moment. "The DEA is going to want to debrief you formally. Vasquez requested it for tomorrow morning." She paused. "Good work today, Jake." It was the second time she had said it. Cole did not repeat things that were merely polite. She repeated things that were true and important enough to say twice. Jake thanked her and went back to his report. Rex shifted beside him, pressing his shoulder against Jake's knee, in the brief specific contact of a dog checking in, and then settled back into his watching posture, with the amber eyes moving through the terminal, and the easy patience of an animal that had never once needed to be told that the work mattered. Outside the terminal, in the corridor that connected the private aviation wing to the main concourse, the normal operational rhythm of O'Hare continued its indifferent passage through the afternoon. Thousands of people moving through channels designed to get them from one place to another efficiently, most of them unaware that 2 corridors away a storage room door was standing open, under federal seal, and a 7-month case was completing its final documents in the hands of the people who had spent 7 months building it. The world did not stop for the things that happened inside it. It simply kept moving, and the things that happened inside it either went into the record or they did not. And today, because a 25-year-old officer in a blue uniform had stayed where his dog told him to stay, and documented instead of retreating, the things that happened had gone into the record with a completeness that $30 billion was not going to be sufficient to revise. Jake's formal debrief with Vasquez ran for 3 hours and 14 minutes the following morning, in a conference room at the Federal Building downtown that smelled of old coffee and the specific staleness of a room used for serious conversations that were not supposed to leave it. Vasquez was precise and unhurried, the way she was with everything. asking questions in the sequence that built the record, rather than the sequence that satisfied curiosity. And Jake answered them the same way he had been answering everything since the glass doors of the private terminal. In order, factually, without the editorializing that Cole had warned him against, and that he had not needed the warning to avoid, because it was simply not how he operated. When they finished, Vasquez closed her file and looked at him with the flat, professional eyes that had been assessing him for 3 hours. "Your body camera footage," she said, "is the cleanest documentation of an evidence discovery I have seen in 7 months of building this case. The timestamp sequence, the chain of custody from the K9 alert through the room opening, the fact that you were recording before anything happened rather than after." She paused. "That's going to matter in court." "Cole told me to run it on routine sweeps," Jake said. Vasquez looked at him. "Listen to your sergeant," she said, and the sentence carried the weight of a woman who had spent 20 years watching cases collapse because someone made a decision their supervisor had told them not to make. The DEA case against Elliot Cross was filed formally 3 days after the terminal. The charges spanned 4 federal statutes and named Cross as the primary in a trafficking network that had been operating through private aviation infrastructure at 7 airports over a period of 4 years. The shell company cargo routing, the credential exploitation network, the bypass access pattern, all of it assembled into a charging document that was 112 pages and that named 14 additional defendants, including the parent company of the contractor that had built the credentialing vulnerability into its system upgrades. Jake read the public filing summary on his phone during a perimeter sweep and felt nothing dramatic about it. He felt the specific satisfaction of a thing done correctly, reaching its correct destination, which was quieter than dramatic and more durable. Nina Hart's cooperation with the federal case was made public in the filing, as required by procedure. The disclosure generated news coverage that ran for 4 days across every major outlet. The story of a flight attendant who had spent 7 months inside a federal investigation, carrying the weight of it alone, who had calculated what today was going to require, and had prepared for it with photographs taken before she said the words that she knew would produce the response that would give the DEA's case its cleanest possible foundation. The coverage characterized her variously as a hero, a brave whistleblower, a federal asset, a woman who risked everything. Jake had a different characterization that he did not share publicly, because it was not his characterization to share. What Nina Hart had been was a person who found something true and decided that the truth was worth the specific and calculable cost of making it visible, and who had made that decision 7 months before the terminal floor, and had kept making it every day for 7 months without recognition or protection or certainty about the outcome. She called Jake 4 days after the filing. He was in the department parking lot, finishing a shift, when his phone showed an unknown number, and he answered it the way he answered unknown numbers, with the neutral professional tone that committed to nothing until he knew what was on the other end. "Officer Mercer," she said. He recognized her voice immediately. The roughness at the edges had faded. Her airway had healed the way the paramedics said it would, cleanly and completely, which was the medical outcome and not the only outcome that mattered. "Ms. Hart," he said. "I wanted to say something to you directly," she said, "before the case moves far enough that there's too much procedure between us for a direct conversation to feel appropriate." Jake leaned against his unit and listened. "I put you in a situation," she said. "I put your dog in a situation. Neither of you were told what the situation was. I made a decision that you and Rex were going to be part of something without being asked whether you wanted to be part of it. And the reason I made that decision was that I needed the discovery to be clean and independent. And the only way for it to be clean and independent was for the person making it not to know what they were going to find." She paused. That was the right operational decision. I've made my peace with it professionally. But I wanted to say to you personally that I understand what I asked of you without asking. Jake was quiet for a moment. Rex was in the back of the unit, amber eyes visible through the window, watching Jake with the patient attention of a dog monitoring its handler for cues about the emotional content of a situation. "You went down on a terminal floor," Jake said. "You knew what was going to happen, and you chose it. I didn't know what was happening, and I responded to what I saw." He paused. "I think the weight of what you're describing is distributed pretty unevenly between us." A silence. Then Nina said, "Rex found the room." "Rex finds everything," Jake said. "That's his job, and he's never wrong." "Tell him I'm grateful," she said. "He won't understand the concept," Jake said, "but I'll let him know." Something in her voice on the other end was lighter than it had been in the terminal. Not relief exactly, the specific quality of someone who has been carrying a weight for so long that the absence of it has not yet settled into the body as normal, but who can feel the absence beginning to become familiar. They did not speak for long. The conversation ended the way honest conversations between people who do not know each other well often ended, with a clean conclusion and the clear understanding that what had been said had been what needed to be said and did not require elaboration. Jake stood in the parking lot for a moment after the call with Rex, watching him through the glass. He thought about the 7 months Nina had carried the investigation inside Cross's operation, checking in with her DEA contact through channels that Cross's security monitoring could not intercept, photographing cargo containers in the aft holds of charter aircraft, filing internal complaints that were dismissed, and accepting the dismissals as part of the cost of staying inside long enough for the case to be complete. He thought about her calculating the terminal floor, the assault she was going to invite, the specific choreography of a person arranging themselves to be the most effective witness to their own harm. He thought about Rex, sitting at the base of the maintenance access door with the amber eyes and the formal alert posture, waiting for Jake to catch up to what the dog already knew. The case moved through the federal system with the specific momentum of a well-built prosecution. The contractor company entered a cooperation agreement within 3 weeks, providing the technical documentation of the credential vulnerability and the names of the company employees who had implemented the backdoor access deliberately. That documentation expanded the case to 11 airports and added 19 defendants to the filing. Cross's legal team filed 7 motions in the first month, each of which was addressed in the record by the documentation that Jake's body camera and incident report had established on the day of the terminal, and each of which was denied. Commissioner Bradley did not call the department again. His relationship with Cross, which had been the kind of relationship that existed in public and functioned in private, became the kind of relationship that no one referenced because referencing it served no one's interests. This was the specific way that certain relationships ended, not with confrontation or consequence, but with the withdrawal of utility. And Jake understood this was an outcome rather than a resolution. But he understood the difference between the two and knew which one was actually available to him. Cole called Jake into her office 6 weeks after the terminal for what she described as a routine supervisory review. He sat across from her desk with Rex beside him, and she went through the review in the orderly way she went through everything. And at the end of it, she set down her folder and looked at him. "Your incident report from the terminal," she said. "It's being used as a training document." Jake looked at her. "Vasquez requested permission to use it in federal agent training for evidence discovery documentation," Cole said. "I approved the request." She paused. "The specific section they want to use is the timeline from the canine alert through the formal discovery. The sequence of decisions, the radio calls a transmission rather than after, the documentation as process rather than response." She met his eyes. You did that because I told you to run your camera on routine sweeps. You did it correctly because you understood why the instruction mattered, rather than just following it. She looked at Rex. And your dog found the room because he was doing exactly what he was built to do, in the exact moment the case needed him to do it. Rex looked at Cole with the amber eyes. His tail moved once, the brief acknowledgement of someone who has received a direct communication and considers it accurate. Cole looked back at the dog for a moment, with the specific expression of a woman who did not often allow herself to be moved by things, and was currently being moved by a German Shepherd. Then she looked at Jake. "Dismissed," she said, which in Cole's language meant, "This conversation is complete, and everything that needed to be said in it has been said." Jake walked the East Terminal corridor on his next shift, with Rex at his left heel, and the blue uniform, and the dark hair, and the 25-year-old face that had looked at Elliot Cross across a private terminal floor, and held the position because a dog had told him to hold it. The East Corridor camera was running a clean, uninterrupted feed to the security monitoring system. The maintenance access door to East 4 was locked, with a new physical deadbolt installed by Harding's team the week after the federal seal came off. The private aviation concourse ran its routine operations with the specific normalcy of a system that has been corrected and is functioning correctly, and will continue to function correctly as long as the people inside it remember what it cost the last time it did not. Rex ran the sweep with the amber eyes and the working dog's precise attention, checking everything that needed checking, dismissing everything that didn't, moving through the corridor with the same quality of presence he had brought to every sweep of every space in 11 months of service. The presence that said, "I am paying attention to what is true, and I will not stop paying attention, regardless of how long the shift runs or how routine the morning feels." At the end of the sweep, in the seating area near the glass doors where it had started, Rex stopped. He looked at the doors. He looked at Jake. He sat. Not an alert. Not a response to a threat. The specific sitting of a dog who has completed a thing and is marking the completion with his body, because his body was the most honest instrument available to him, and honesty was the only language he had ever spoken. Jake put his hand on the dog's head, and Rex leaned into it, with the brief specific pressure that meant, "I know. We are here. We are doing this. We are not going to stop." Some truths did not require thunder or headlines or the dramatic reversals that stories were supposed to contain to feel real. Some truths were simpler and heavier than that. A 25-year-old officer who stayed where his dog told him to stay. A woman who knew what the floor was going to feel like and chose it anyway, because the case needed a clean foundation, and she was the only person who could provide one. A German Shepherd with amber eyes who had been doing exactly his job at exactly the right moment, and had never once needed anyone to explain to him why it mattered. The record was complete. The record was accurate. The record was in federal custody, and in a training document, and in the permanent documentation of a case that was going to run for years in courtrooms that Jake would attend as a witness and testify in with the same voice he used for everything, even and factual and complete. Elliot Cross had put his hand on a woman's throat in front of 40 people and straightened his tie while she was still on the floor. And he had done it because he believed that consequences were a system that applied to other people, and that $30 billion was sufficient distance from the system to keep it that way. He had been wrong. He had been wrong from the moment Rex locked on a glass door and sat. And he had been wrong about every calculation that followed, and the record said so in 112 pages, and a body camera timeline, and a dog's formal alert in a service corridor at 1:34 in the afternoon on a Tuesday. And the record was the only thing that outlasted the certainty of men who believed they were untouchable. It always had been, and now it always would be.